Today's video is brought to you by Teamgroup's Xtreem ARGB memory. With its unique mirror design and high speeds of up to 4000 MHz, it will undoubtedly make a great addition to your build. To learn more, go to the link in the video description. In my previous comparison, we had a look at how the FX-6300 and the i3-3240 held up against each other over the years. It turned out to be an interesting comparison, which you can watch over here. Today we're going to be doing something similar, though this time with mid-range parts from the same generation. And in case you're not yet aware from the title of this video, these CPUs are the i5-3470 and the FX-8350. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking. That's something I'm going to leave for the end of the video. So let me quickly explain a couple of things, go through the specs, and we will dive straight into the results. First thing that a lot of you are probably questioning is the reason behind picking an i5-3470 instead of the 3570K. And the reason for that is simply because the 3570K was priced around $40 more. And I have no clue why everybody thinks that it is the CPU that should be compared to the FX-8350. Even the i5-3470 was a bit more expensive than the 8-core FX, so I'm absolutely confident that this is a fair comparison. When it comes to specs for the Intel platform, we're using an MSI Z77A G43, while on the AMD side we have a 990 FXA UD3 Revision 4 motherboard. Both CPUs are being cooled using the out-of-the-box coolers, and all the other parts are exactly the same. We have 16GB of DDR3 1866 MHz memory, a 700-watt FSP Hydro power supply, and of course a superclocked EVGA GTX 1070 graphics card. All the games were tested using lowest settings at 1080p, though some of the titles were also tested using higher settings to see how these CPUs perform under those conditions. Okay, so as always, let's begin with software first, and starting off we have Cinebench R15. For the single-core score, the i5 easily takes the cake, outperforming the FX processor by 31%, though when it comes to multi-core, the FX-8350 pulls ahead by 33%. Looking at Blender results, we see the FX-8350 beating the i5 in both BMW and classroom scenes by 14% and 27% respectively. Next, we have Corona, where the FX processor takes the lead by 26%. Now, some of you may think that 2 minutes isn't that big of a difference, though if we had a bigger project that would take, let's say, 16 hours to render on the i5, the FX-8350 would render that same project in less than 12 hours. Moving on, we have Vegas Pro 14, where the FX-8350 is once again beating the i5-3470 by 15%. Next up, we have V-Ray, where we see the biggest difference of 54% in favor of the FX processor. When it comes to 7-zip, the FX-8350 is yet again outperforming the i5-3470 in both compression and decompression by 39% and 77% respectively. For our final software, we have Intel Burn Test, where the i5-3470 is finally able to beat the 8-core FX by a pretty big margin of 53%. Alright, now let's move on to gaming results, which, let's face it, is what most of you have been waiting for. We're going to begin with older titles first, and starting off we have Warhammer Space Marine, where the i5-3470 is outperforming the FX-8350 by around 10 to 12%. When it comes to max settings, we're basically getting similar results, so there is not much to talk about here. Next, we have Saints Row the Third, and here the i5 is beating the FX-8350 once again, albeit this time the difference can range from 30 to 50%, and we're seeing similar margins using highest settings. Next on the list is Crysis 2, where we're getting very similar experience on both processors, regardless of which settings are being used. Moving on, we have Battlefield 3, which prefers the i5 more since it has a roughly 15% advantage over the FX processor, at least when comparing them in single player. Looking at multiplayer results, the difference doesn't seem to be as big, though still it is a win of roughly 5 to 10% in favor of the Intel CPU. The i5 has this weird problem though. It randomly begins to heavily stutter while playing multiplayer, and even though it is very rare and usually doesn't last longer than 10 seconds, I don't remember experiencing anything like it with the FX-8350. Next up, we have Far Cry 3, which is yet another game that seems to hate the FX-8350, cause here the i5-3470 is easily outperforming the 8-core FX by around 25%. Crysis 3 is next, where the FX-8350 finally manages to claim its first victory in gaming. At first, the difference doesn't seem to be that big, maybe around 5 to 8% in favor of the FX processor, though things become much more interesting once we step outside. Here we can see the 8-core FX not only beating the i5 by around 20 to 30%, but also delivering a much smoother experience. Moving on to our next game, we have Battlefield 4, and using lowest settings, performance is pretty much identical between the two. Both CPUs seem to either beat or fall behind each other by a few frames depending on the situation, so I believe that calling this a tie would be a fair decision. What's interesting is that the i5 starts struggling a bit once we max out the settings, while the FX-8350 manages to deliver an overall better experience thanks to a few extra frames and a much more stable frame time. The FX processor also seems to handle multiplayer better than the i5-3470 when using lowest settings, at least in these particular situations. Next, we have Dying Light, which seems to run exactly the same on both platforms regardless of whether we use low or ultra settings. Next up, we have GTA 5, where the Intel processor has a 5 to 10% advantage in certain areas, both at low and ultra settings. For our next game, we have The Witcher 3, and here we see the i5 delivering around 5 to 7% more frames than the FX-8350, yet Intel's victory doesn't last too long, cause once we step inside Novigrad, the i5 actually begins to struggle, while the FX-8350 has a roughly 5 to 10% higher frame rate and a noticeably more consistent frame time. We see a similar behavior when using higher settings as well, though this time the i5 feels even choppier than it did before, making it an easy win for the FX-8350. Need for Speed 2015 is yet another game that prefers the i5-3470, since it is outperforming the FX processor by around 5 to 12%. The gap does close a bit once we max out the settings, though the i5 still manages to outperform the FX-8350 by a few frames. Rainbow Six Siege is next on our list, and while the FX-8350 does have a small advantage in some areas, this is not the kind of situation where you'd be able to tell the difference. Next on the list is The Division, which actually runs quite a bit better on the FX-8350. Here we can see that the AMD processor can deliver up to 25% more frames than the i5, while also running noticeably smoother. Once we increase the settings, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between the two, though when it comes to the frame time consistency, the FX processor is a bit better.
Hold up, I'm out for a sec.
Moving on, we have Watch Dogs 2, where the FX-8350 is outperforming the i5-3470 by around 8 to 15%. Next up, we have PUBG, and here the i5 manages to deliver roughly 8 to 12% more frames. By the way, if you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate if you could support my work by using Amazon affiliate links provided in the description, and don't worry, there is no need to pay anything extra. Next, we have Far Cry 5, which unsurprisingly runs better on the i5-3470 that can deliver up to 24% more frames than the FX-8350. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a game that absolutely hates quad-core CPUs, and as we can see, that's exactly the case. The Intel processor simply refuses to load things up most of the time, such as objects or NPCs. The audio also tends to cut off at one part of the benchmark, making the game pretty much unplayable on the i5-3470, at least when using DirectX 12, which is set by default. To be honest, the FX-8350 doesn't necessarily deliver a silky smooth experience either, though at least it does a much better job than the Intel processor. Everything loads up just fine, you're getting 10 to 20% more frames and a more stable frame time, making it an easy win for the FX processor. Even using high settings, the game is somewhat playable on the FX-8350, but unfortunately the same cannot be said about the i5-3470. Thankfully, switching to DirectX 11 helps the Intel processor a lot, so I definitely suggest enabling DirectX 11 in this game if you have a quad-core processor. Moving on, we have Battlefield 5, and even though the frame rate doesn't seem to be much different between the two processors, the i5 stutters terribly compared to the FX-8350 that handles things much better thanks to the extra headroom. When it comes to multiplayer, we're also getting similar results. The i5 tends to frequently struggle, while the FX-8350 manages to deliver a more enjoyable experience regardless of whether you're playing on a 32 or 64 player map.
I'll treat you, pal.
Next up, we have Apex Legends, and to be honest, I thought that this game doesn't really care much about the CPU as long as it has 4 cores, but it turns out that's not the case, because here we're seeing the FX-8350 delivering a much more stable frame time compared to the i5, both at low and high settings. The Intel processor would also get very choppy at times, and I've never experienced anything like it on the AMD CPU, which basically had a completely flat frame time. Also, since the i5 is maxing out, you're basically unable to communicate with people through apps such as Discord or even the in-game voice chat, because you either sound like a robot or your voice cuts off all the time, which is not an issue with the FX processor. Looking at Division 2 results, we see the FX-8350 outperforming the i5-3470 by around 15 to 25%, and as you've probably noticed, it also runs quite a bit smoother than the Intel processor. Other than frequent stutters and freezes, the Ivy Bridge i5 also struggles to load things up from time to time, making it an easy win for the FX-8350. For our last game, we have Call of Duty Warzone, and while both CPUs seem to have a very identical frame rate, the game is much more playable on the FX-8350 thanks to the more consistent frame times. By the way, the game also tends to freeze on the Intel processor from time to time, which is not something I've experienced with the AMD processor. Looking at CPU temperatures, we see the FX-8350 running around 13 degrees Celsius cooler using Intel burn test, though it is worth mentioning that the stock cooler does get noticeably louder. When it comes to the VRM temps, unfortunately the Intel motherboard doesn't have any sensors, yet I can still confirm that the VRMs on the 990 FXA motherboard get warmer, plus there's also the Northbridge on the AMD platform that generates extra heat, so while it's not necessarily the processor itself that gets hot, overall the FX system does require, let's say, an extra fan to keep things cool. By the way, keep in mind that I do all of my testing outside the case with only a single 120mm fan blowing air onto the VRMs. When it comes to power consumption numbers, the FX-8350 consumes 60% more power at idle. It also consumes roughly 150% more when rendering a scene using Blender or Corona, and of course around 38% more power while gaming. So basically a 300 watt power supply is all you need for the i5, while with the FX processor 400 watts is necessary. Just before finishing the video, let's also quickly talk about overclocking, which by the way is something you can do on any FX CPU using any chipset, unlike Intel that only lets you do that on K-series CPUs paired with Z-series chipsets. I was able to overclock the FX-8350 to 4.49 GHz. While at it, I also decided to overclock the RAM, Northbridge, as well as Hypertransport. And here is the best part. I achieved these numbers using the stock cooler. The cooler that a lot of people back in the day claimed needs to be replaced with an aftermarket one. And in case you're wondering, there are no extra fans or any changes made to the build. The ambient temperature is the same, and we're using the exact same parts that we used at stock. Overclocking the FX-8350 helps us close the gap in most titles where the i5 had the lead, in some cases delivering even better performance, and of course also increasing the gap in titles which already ran better on the AMD processor. Obviously, we're also getting a noticeable improvement in productivity. For example, in Corona, the overclocked FX-8350 now renders the scene 34% faster, and in V-Ray it is now 67% faster than the i5. Keep in mind that all of this improvement also comes with an uplift in power consumption, meaning that a 500 watt power supply is necessary to achieve an overclock like this. Both CPU and VRM temperatures aren't critical either. The processor maxes out at 69 degrees Celsius using Intel burn test, which is basically the worst case scenario, while the VRM temps don't exceed 80 degrees, which means we still have a 40-degree headroom before the VRMs start throttling. Honestly, I expected the FX-8350 to do much worse in most games, at least according to other reviews. But other than a few titles, I think it did a pretty good job. Out of 21 games tested, it lost to the i5 in 8 of them, but performed better in 9 titles, most of which released within the last 6 years, and that tells us that getting an FX-8350 was perhaps future-proof thanks to the extra headroom. When it comes to productivity, the FX-8350 is the clear winner, at least when talking about workloads that can take advantage of extra cores. In my opinion, the only problem that the FX-8350 has here is power consumption. The i5 is a much more efficient processor and there is no way around it. But other than that, the FX-8350 is a CPU that I could recommend getting over an i5 if we went back in time. The FX-8320, for example, was also a great bang for the buck CPU, especially if you also overclocked it. And the FX-6300 is another great processor that I'd easily recommend getting over a 3rd or 4th gen i3 any day. Alright, so finally I want to talk about a couple of FX-8370 videos you may have already seen from both Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed, where they claim that the 8-core FX loses to dual-core CPUs with 4 threads. Now, I don't want to turn this into a drama or anything. Both of them are great YouTubers that know much more about PCs than I do, but I highly doubt that a dual-core Pentium is able to perform better or even be on par for that matter with an overclocked 8-core FX in most situations. For example, in the FX-8370 revisit video from Gamers Nexus, we can see that even with a 4.9 GHz OC, it barely performs any better than a dual-core Pentium G5500 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Steve also mentions that the FX processor is very inconsistent in Division 2, while it runs perfectly fine on my FX-8350. Steve from Hardware Unboxed also claims in one of his videos that the FX-8370 with an overclock of 4.4 GHz is either on par or worse than the Pentium G4560 in games such as Battlefield 1, Witcher 3, and Rainbow Six Siege, even though I'm quite confident that it should be easily beating the dual-core Pentium in all of those games. In a more recent video of his, he also shows us that the FX-8370 doesn't perform any better than the i5-2500K in Shadow of the Tomb Raider using DirectX 12, which definitely shouldn't be happening because in my tests, the FX-8350 performs much better than the i5-3470, a CPU that is slightly better than the i5-2500K at stock. I have absolutely no clue what's going on here. I consider these results to be misleading, and this is definitely something we're going to be investigating in one of my upcoming videos. Either way, thank you guys for watching. Feel free to support my work by using Amazon affiliate links provided below. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content, and I'll see y'all in the next one.